Okay, we're just going to get started. Hello, everyone. My name is Dana Al-Kurd. I'm a researcher at the Arab Center for Research and Policy Studies. Thank you for joining us for our Palestine Studies Working Group. It's the continuation on the second day. So today, before we begin, I just have a few announcements regarding some of the logistics of the conference. First, to those of you who are attending the session via Zoom, you can, if you have any questions, you can use the Q&A tab at the bottom to type out your question. The people who will be able to interject using their picture and sound are the people that are present on the panel themselves, whereas attendees can just use the Q&A tab, and we will get to the questions at the end of the session. Secondly, for those following along on social media, we regrettably had to cancel our history session for today with Amina Abdul Karim's paper. So in case somebody's wondering where that link is, unfortunately we had to cancel it. But we will be having a continuation of this session with Ayah's paper at 4:40 Doha time. So Hanna will be presenting and we'll be discussing his work from 3 to 4:30, and then we'll have a 10-minute break, and then you can stay logged on to attend Ayah's session. So without further ado, I'll go ahead and introduce our presenter today, Hanna Kreitem. He is a recent PhD graduate in Media and Communication at Northumbria University in the UK. He holds a master's degree in Business Administration from Durham University. And his research interests are, centered around the internet and technology and digital inequalities related to emerging technologies, as well as inequalities perpetuated as forms of oppression. So today he'll be presenting on basically weaponization of access in Palestine. Hanna, I will give you 20 to 30 minutes. So I'll give you a 20-minute warning and then a 5-minute warning. And then hopefully you'll be able to wrap up by 30 minutes, and then we can begin the feedback from me and your participant discussant. So I will start the clock, and you will have up to 30 minutes.
Thank you very much, Dana, and thank you for the Arab Center for Research for giving me this opportunity. As Dana said, my presentation is on weaponization of access, or the use of control power to just 1 second. I need just to fix the sharing the screen. I dropped the wrong one. Okay, so my presentation today is on the weaponization of access, with focus on the case of Palestine, Israel. Weaponization of access is defined throughout my research as the use of control and power over network communication and access to information communication technology, particularly the internet, to extend colonial practice and further control over different groups of people. To begin with, I need just to give a quick overview of some of the terms I'll be using throughout my work here. For the network society, I'm using definitions from Castells and Van Dyke to look as the new social morphology of our societies, and it is the form that we are increasingly moving towards, which relies on media and digital networks to organize our relationships as communities and societies. It offers a lot of affordances, including ability to participation in global network society for organizing towards liberation, which is the most relevant to our discussion today. Is it open for all? Unfortunately not. To be able to effectively participate within the network society, you need to have access to information communication technology, particularly the internet. Other than that, unfortunately, you don't have the opportunity to participate or be a member of this society. In terms of control, network society allows for right. Over the years, different regimes and states recognized the opportunities offered by network society and by communication technology for liberation, and as such started to try to extend their control from the real life, between quote unquote, towards the information communication technology affordances. The open communications were worrisome for these regimes, and that started from early days of electrical communication, from telegram to telephone and various other correspondence, towards the digital communication more recently. I relied on Castell's ideas on network powers, which are networking, network making, network, and the network powers, to define the regime or state control over communication technologies within their ability to limit opportunities for access as itself, to the act of monitoring and surveillance, which results into intimidation and threat of violence, which affects how people are behaving online in the form of self-censorship, which is yet another power we need to look at, the censorship to set the discourse and control the message. I don't really need to speak a lot about the context of Palestinian issue for this audience. However, very quickly, when I say Palestinian territory is the area defined by the 1949 armistice line, and within that lies the West Bank and Gaza, and within the West Bank we have multiple areas, A, B, C. Within Hebron, multiple areas as well. However, we will focus more on the larger areas, the A, B, C. In Palestine, telecommunication infrastructure was first laid by the British Mandate, who wanted to connect their own heads of command, or muqata'at, as we refer to in the current days. They wanted to create a sort of network of communication between these heads of command, and within that they laid the first telephony infrastructure in historical Palestine. That was between 1920 and 1948. With the establishment of Israel in 1948, it inherited the infrastructure, particularly areas outside of the 1949 armistice line. So the whole historical Palestine, except West Bank, East Jerusalem, and Gaza Strip. However, that changed again in 1967 when Israel extended its control over the whole area as well as the Golan Heights. This put Israel as the entity in charge of extending the telecommunication infrastructure over the whole of historic Palestine between 1967 and 1995. In 1995, the telecommunication infrastructure in areas A, B, and to some extent C, plus Gaza, were handed over to the Palestinian Authority, which in turn handed it over to Palestine Telecommunication Company, PALTE. Now, within the years of 1967 and 1995, you can imagine that it was the height of extension of landlines and basic telecommunication infrastructure. As a result of increased demand, as a result of increased abilities for fuel, as a result of increased affordability of these novel communication means. To cope with the demand in 1985, Israeli government established BASIC, the Israeli Telecommunication Corp Limited, to be able to cope with the increased demand and to be able to effectively extend infrastructure to everyone. So here we see the move from government-controlled or directly government-controlled infrastructure to infrastructure controlled by a company, which was established by the government in a way or another. The main reason of establishing BASIC was because the government was not effective in extending that infrastructure. During that period, anyone who was living there, I'm not sure if, then, there was high levels of censorship and control over all means or all media, especially for Palestinians. No TV or radio licenses were issues for Palestinians, extremely high censorship on print media, and so on. If we looked at this map from 1984, right before the establishment of BASIC, we can see two blank areas, West Bank and Gaza, which represent that there were less than 20% of households in these areas had telephone lines. Some research, particularly by Solomon and Raisin in 1988, tried to categorize ability or access to telephone lines by ethnicity, I would say. Yeah. So the Jewish households, more than 3/4 of Jewish households had access to telephone lines, while non-Jewish households only 16.8% had. The reasons that Solomon and Raisin attributed as reasons for this discrepancy is first that the non-Jewish households lower income makes them place a lower value on telephone communication as compared with other goods, but still mentioning that government policies of investing unequally among different populations as another important factor. So here we can see that access was indeed used as a weapon to extend colonial control, with difference in investment done in infrastructure among different populations. After 1995, and to extend the idea that the number of telephone lines that was available for non-Jewish households in historical Palestine was not related to technical capabilities, we can look at the increase or the high increase of number of telephone lines available post 1995. In 1996, we had almost 80,000 lines, jumping within 14 years or 15 years to almost 300,000 lines. During the first few years of Paltel work, they did not really have to invest heavily in infrastructure. They used almost the same infrastructure available, which yet again shows that the technical infrastructure was not the real reason why Palestinian households did not have access to phone lines. If you are old as me, you would remember, and living in Palestine, West Bank, you would remember that period when more and more people had access to phone lines. Your book where you would have stored of the phone numbers would increase very quickly. For myself, I remember that our house had a phone line after more than 10 years of waiting, or more than 10 years after applying for a phone line, and that was in the early 90s. So this shows that there was sort of demand from Palestinians for phone lines, but it was not met. Does that mean that after 1995 Palestinians had full control over their telecommunication infrastructure? No, it does not. Why? Because as part of the accord signed between the PLOs, later on PA, and Israel, the Palestinians agreed to maintain compatibility with Israeli infrastructure, which meant in practice having to receive pre-approval from Israeli authorities on any equipment or technology imported, used, or offered. Here, Wade mentions an experience where Palestinian telecommunication agency or company and Israeli companies bought identical equipment from Ericsson. The Israeli equipment, or the equipment that were meant to the Israeli company, passed within 2 weeks through the customs, while the Palestinian equipment was held up to 2 years for security checks. I had an experience when I worked with Biozit University, and I believe Ihab was there during that time. We bought a phone exchange from Siemens, and it stayed in the airport for more than 1 year. We were unable to get it in. The only way we were able to get in was that our vendor, the Palestinian vendor, sold it while it was in the airport to an Israeli company, and that Israeli company got it in and then sold it back again to our vendor, which brought it to us, which again reflects the differentiation in policies and practices. Moreover, the accords also meant that all international communication between Palestinian territory and the world had to pass through Israel and Israeli companies. No direct access line was possible and available. And that again was something that Palestinians signed on. The control here did not only cover the infrastructure and the machinery used or the equipment used. It went over to controlling the frequencies. The complicated geography that of historical Palestine, which is shared between Israel and the then newly established Palestinian Authority, meant that coordination in terms of radio frequencies was necessary, particularly because of spillover effect and so on. We have seen requests to establish 3G networks in Palestine since early 2009, but only in 2015 Israel agreed on them. And only in 2018, Israel dedicated 10 megahertz of the frequency band to 2 companies offering 3G services, Palestinian companies offering 3G services. The 10 megahertz may sound or may seem a lot, but if wanted to put it into perspective, 4 years before that, in 2014, Israel allocated 65 megahertz for Israeli companies to extend their services. So we are offering 10 megahertz for 2 Palestinian companies to offer a new service, at the same time offering more than 6 times that frequency band to extend current services. Some of the reasons of why this happened, some researchers, particularly O'Brien and Jill in New York, indicated that the ease of monitoring and eavesdropping of 2G networks was one of the reasons why Israel did not allow handing over of 3G frequencies. The same researcher later on may say that only when Israel developed the technology to eavesdrop and control directly and indirectly, I will mention later the indirect control, the 3G frequencies were handed off. At the same time, there was an economic factor. Noor Arif, which was supposed to be in this conference as well, mentioned that Israeli operators had the ability to offer Palestinian customers better quality services at the expense of Palestinian operators by capitalizing on Israel's superior force as an occupying power and the captive state of the Palestinian market, which yet again provided Israel with more controlling abilities and more controlling power. Now, is the internet important for Palestinians, or is it a defining factor in the Palestinian life and struggle? Many researchers would say yes. And almost, if you walked in the streets in Palestine and asked people, they would say that yes, we use the internet as a very important aspect to communicate with relatives. As a matter of fact, one of the early projects that utilized the internet was in the mid-90s and late 90s by the Center of Continuing Education at Accuracy University, and that connected Palestinians in the West Bank with their relatives in the refugee camps in Lebanon and Jordan and other places. So it provided a window for communication. It provided virtual escapism for Palestinians, which was important for Palestinians to be able to cope with life under occupation. And it helped Palestinians to defy political borders to communicate and organize. At the same time, it helped overcoming more local restrictions. So not only between Palestinians in Palestine with their relatives outside of historical Palestine, but also within different within Palestine, between different localities, different cities, different locations, and so on. We have seen a huge increase in dependence on e-learning, for instance, early 2000 with the increased closures between the cities. Now, but at the same time, that internet was not open. That internet access was controlled not only by Israel but also by the Palestinian Authority. We have seen several attempts over the years, more recent ones just a few months ago, to block websites from being served through internet service providers in Palestine. The main reasons were political and or ethically justified, but again, it's more or less political. The blocking was intermittent. We did not see any constant blocking that extended over more than a few months or so. However, this shows a trend towards increased control over communication. That's from the Palestinian Authority side. From the Israeli side, the control extended from the infrastructure to surveillance. And the control over the Palestinian access or access to Palestinians to information communication technology allowed for testing ground for Israelis' cyber weaponry or cyber arms to prove its efficiency and effectiveness to buyers, I would say. One of these was the infamous Pegasus system that operated in no less than 45 countries, including Palestine, UAE, and many more. More recent reports indicate yet other systems by NSO group that were used on Palestinians at the beginning and extended to other countries. Was the internet controls something on its own? The facts on the ground shows that Israel integrated surveillance weaponry with its direct force apparatus. So we have seen arrests based on activity on social media platforms. We have seen arrests on affiliation. So you don't really have to say something to be arrested. So we have seen some arrests that were merely based on affiliation within a specific WhatsApp group and so on. Helga Suri described this as a form of digital occupation, a frictionless occupation, which is a system that spans territorial and digital control of geographies and people, with control achieved through conventional hard borders and soft controls in digital infrastructure and the digital world. This leads us to viewing the direct practices of control and the control over access and communication infrastructure as instruments to support occupation, thus rendering this control form of weaponization of the power to control access, which is, as we said in the beginning, is the most basic function that provides ability to join the network society. Weaponization of access is a form of control that allows for symmetrical power relationships that favor the empowered actor. In our case, it is Israel, the colonial force, to implement its will and interest through control. Here, we have seen, and this is more described in the paper itself, and which is now published as a book chapter as a beginning, that we have seen cycles of control that started by delaying access to technology and media by itself, then allowing access, but under specific limitations that assured control, assured surveillance, to allowing more and more access, but creating a state of control over the message used over this media. And then this cycle would start again with almost every new technology available. That's basically my contribution here. I'd like to thank you, and I'm open for questions.
Thank you so much, Hanna. I was about to give you a 2-minute warning, so you're right on time. Mm-hmm. Okay, so I have some comments for you. So I'm going to kind of pose some questions, give a little bit of feedback, and then give you some space to, basically answer some of my questions and concerns. So it can be more of a discussion, at least at the beginning here. Because, so the first thing that when I was reading the paper, like it's very interesting and a very good, very in-depth overview of this weaponization of access that is of course going to be useful to both people in academia as well as practitioners that want to understand kind of the situation that's happening in Israel-Palestine. So that was great, but my first question was, where do you want to see this published? Now, it wasn't clear from the paper, because also in the paper you refer to a book, but now just hearing you with your presentation, you said that it's already been published as a book chapter. So that will kind of color the rest of my comments in a sense, because if it's already published as a book chapter, I'm not really, we can discuss this and how best to move forward. If you want to build on the project, then my comments are more relevant, if you see what I'm saying. So basically, how you want to build on the project will impact how you end up framing the project. And that was one of my main points that I wanted to make about this paper, is that the framing might be better suited to a different kind of framing. And I'll give an example. So you say you're going to look at different modes of access. So you look at internet, you talk a little bit about social media, you look at these kinds of escapes like radio. But I think it would be best served either that you define exactly what types of access you're talking about, in the sense that, like, is it any and all types of access that connect you to this network society, or are you going to look at specific kinds? And, are you leaving something out with these decisions, if you know what I mean? So you kind of need to narrowly define what you're looking at, or at least, like, for the continuation of the project, specify what kinds of access you're discussing. Because sometimes in at least this chapter, it kind of seemed like it came in a bit of a disconnected way. Like I was reading something about social media and then I read something about radio. You see what I'm saying? So that was one thing. And then second thing, I didn't really see as much engagement as I would have liked with the work on social media censorship and repression. Now, Israel is an occupying state, and it is unique in its role and how it relates to the Palestinian, its Palestinian subjects, basically. But it's not the only country that weaponizes access, right? So, for example, Gary King looks at social media censorship in China, and he finds that the state censors things online, not necessarily because they're negative towards the state or the regime. So, like, it's not because somebody might say something against the Chinese state that they get censored, but they censor specifically things that spur collective action, and not just negative things. Sometimes it could be, maybe in support of some sort of regime issue or some aspect of the regime, but they don't want people to mobilize. And those are the things that get censored and get deleted. Now, this is in 2013. I'm sure people have built on this work, but it came out in 2013, and it was a very interesting article at the time and a very interesting project. I'm sure they've built on it. So I think that maybe it might be worthwhile to engage with, social media censorship kind of more generally in other contexts. And maybe you can look at your project and frame your project in that way. So how does Israel's impact on internet access, or like how does Israel's strategies control compare or differ from other states? That would be one way to frame it. But you also have to contend with the fact, like I said, that Israel is not a normal state. So it's not presiding over its citizens, it's presiding over an occupying territory. So then it kind of narrows your thinking. Maybe what are other examples of occupiers and internet repression that we might also use here? Hong Kong, Kashmir, Iraq, Georgia. There's a number of ways you can kind of go about it in terms of like what is either currently or has been in the past occupied in the era of the internet. And how is weaponization of access been the same or different given these contexts? So is Israel's occupying nature what causes it to weaponize access in this way? I imagine so. Or is it something very unique about Israel, how it controls Palestinian society? That's maybe even different than not just other oppressive states, but other occupiers. For me, that was an exciting, did you want to say something? Oh, okay.
No, it's fine, carry on. Okay.
Yeah, I'll give you a second. I'll give you a few minutes to respond. So I'm just gonna let the juices flow and then get back to you. So yeah, for me, that was a really exciting prospect. I'm not sure that work like that exists on this kind of comparison. And especially with Israel's role in surveillance, not just within its own borders at this point, it's become, an exporter of authoritarian technologies. This is going to be in high interest, that this kind of project would be in very high interest for people who are interested in internet surveillance more generally, or internet repression more generally, not just the Israel case. The second thing I want to say was, you mentioned it in your presentation, but it was kind of very briefly mentioned in the paper, which is the varying levels of control between the PA and Israel. So that's also kind of unique to the Palestinian condition, is that we have the Israeli occupiers, the Israeli repression. We also have another layer. And you talk about this frictionless occupation, or the frictionless control, digital occupation, sorry, that you mentioned as a concept from some previous literature. But isn't it the case, all of Oslo is attempting to create a frictionless control, right? So maybe, if I was looking at this paper, if I don't know, I receive a book project from you where this is just one part, and then you have all these other chapters that kind of flesh out the story and give me examples, I would want to see you contend with the fact that this weaponization of access is perhaps one part of a strategy of overall frictionless control. But that's just one idea. There's again a number of ways to frame it. So in either way, whatever way you want to frame it, whether you want to compare it to other occupiers or compare it to other authoritarian states, or just stay in this particular case, Palestine can still be your primary case. I wouldn't expect you, like, I hate when I get this feedback where people are like, can you please go and visit 7 other countries? Like, I'm not telling you to do that, but you can at least kind of use it, maybe secondary literature to compare, and in that way make a theoretical contribution. Because I'm not sure, like, it wasn't clear to me from the paper, or like, are you trying to make a theoretical contribution, or is this kind of more ideographic and descriptive, which is completely fine. Some things need to be described before we can build on them. Like, you're the first person who's going to write about this systematically, fantastic. But I think there is a theoretical contribution to be made here. And I don't want to maybe limit the scope of your work to just the ideographic or descriptive, realm. So normatively, we know why you and I, or the people that are in our attendance here, are interested in the Palestine case. But how do you justify using this case? Like, are you trying to understand, like I said, some unique aspect of internet control using this case? Or are you simply interested in this case because you want to provide that ideographic description of Palestine and the Palestinian condition? There are different kinds of case studies. And I know that you're in media and communication, and I'm in poli-sci, but if I'd be so bold, I think, you know, some of our poli-sci literature would be really useful here. So I can share some of that literature with you, the case study literature on typologies of case studies. So Andrew and Bennett come to mind here. That might be really useful to just framing, you know, the decision you made in looking at Palestine. That will also, again, help the reader understand what kind of contribution you're trying to make with the case of Palestine. Let me see here, my comments are on my notepad here. So, okay, and I think I've kind of mentioned this briefly, but you use the term oppressing regime. So I assume you mean authoritarian regimes generally. And so I want you to engage more with authoritarianism and repression literature. There's a recent book called, I mean, it's probably on your radar, but, you know, forgive me if it already is, but I'll just mention it anyway, called The Internet and Political Protest and Autocracies by Rod and Weidman. So that might be helpful. I can also link that to you. Sorry, I'm just reading my comments. So some stuff, like I said, seem a little bit disconnected, like the portions on escapism. And I really think it has to do with defining where you want the project to go. Then you'll know what stays in and what comes out and how you address it. And then the last thing I have to say is, for me, I read it and it read like a very good like description and lit review of the kind of like the network society, those kinds of terminologies that I need to understand to read your work. But for me, it's like it was missing the next logical step. And I think maybe if you turned it into a book project, like you have, you know, a number of opportunities as where you're going to go with that logical step. So the next logical step for me was, okay, so how does this weaponization of access impact resistance? Are people using different tools now? Has this weaponization of access actually impacted how people utilize the internet? Is protest capacity impacted? Maybe you can use a protest data set, like I have one that I developed. You can use something similar and see if there are differences in protest levels before and after certain laws or restrictions were passed. Maybe that's one example of how you can, you know, what's the empirical implication of what you're telling me? Or you can do kind of subnational case studies where you can explain how the internet impacts Palestinian civil society through the lens of particular groups or the lens of particular regions. I don't know. What comes to mind for me is Jerusalem, Al-Quds and the Al-Aqsa protests of 2017, and their use of social media to mobilize people against the restrictions on Al-Aqsa. So you can do it regionally, so you know, you can do it like by city, you could do it by group. Maybe I wanted to know more. You know what I mean? I wanted like examples. I wanted like the thick, you know, the thick analysis of these kinds of like really rich case studies, which you know more than me, of course, given your positionality. So I'm sure you'd be able to do that very easily. Provide me with those kinds of details and that kind of rich analysis. And again, I'm gonna give you some time to answer me now. Give me kind of an understanding of where you wanted to go with this. But for me, I would love to see this as a book project. I think it has the potential, and it shouldn't just be a book chapter. It shouldn't just be a single article. I think it's a really important work and very relevant, you know, to the rest of what social science is grappling with. I mean, if you look at a lot of the calls, for example, the calls for fellowships this year, they're all about, you know, autocratization, about weaponization of the internet, about all of these things. So you should capitalize on your very well, you know, your how well you know your own case to add to this conversation. Anyway, that's all I had. We have about 5 minutes for you to respond, and then we can open it up to your participant discussant.
Okay, thank you very much, Dana. So this work was actually a part of a larger project that I wanted to embark on, that would focus on weaponization of access, not only in Palestine and Israel, but as a general theoretical concept, and then extended to cover the possibilities or the potential for resistance and how it was used, the interplay between the authoritarian regimes and the counterpart or their people within different levels. This work presented today is, I would say, the exploratory study for that project. And I selected the case of Palestine Israel basically because I'm familiar with it. So there's the practicality aspect of it, but also more importantly, because here the perpetrator or the colonial power is clearer than in many other cases. And the control is much clearer as well. If we looked at the access to infrastructure, it's obvious that between 1967 and 1995, the number of people that had access to communication technology based on their ethnicity, the difference here is obvious. So I thought it's a good place to do this sort of exploratory study. Where I wanted to go with it furtherward, actually, I did apply for a postdoctoral research, 3-year postdoctoral research that included a book on this topic, again, as to theorize the concept of weaponization of access, and to study through different examples in different settings around different areas in the world, covering different technology, different media. The meaning of access here is directly connected to the ability to join the network society. So by access here, I mean anything that allows you to join the network society. I wanted it to be open to changes over the years. So we used to talk about access to the internet as the ability to join network society. Now we start talking about not affordable access, but meaningful access. So meaningful access here is not only having access to the internet, but the ability to use it, the ability to utilize whatever tools available, and so on. So I wanted it to be flexible, to accommodate the changes in what levels of access is needed to be an effective member of the network society. So thank you for the direction to the book by Brad and Polnar. I'll definitely look it up. And
yeah, I'll send you. You don't have to write them down. I'll send you the links because I know it's very quick talk. But
great. So yes, to put it briefly, say it briefly that yes, this may seem in some parts disconnected. This may seem in some parts that, as you said, missing the next logical step, because it is some sort of an exploratory study that I tried to pitch it. So I did a similar, not the same presentation, but similar work on earlier research in different conferences, different student conferences, to collect feedback and see where it's possible where to use it. And I used comments there to improve, or to develop. I wouldn't say improve, to develop the work. And then I published it as a book chapter again to see the potential, and I did apply it for different research projects. But in reality, as I mentioned very briefly before we started here, I divorced academia, or I would say that we are now on a break. So until we are back again together.
It caused us all to be kind of a bit of on break, but I just want to speak to its importance as a project.
Yes.
So
thank you very much. I do believe that it is very important to look at network interference through the lens of weaponization, which would make it as an integral part of the practice of authoritarianism and oppressive regimes, rather than part of how the internet is. So many people would think that, yes, well, in this country I'm not able to do voice calls over WhatsApp. That's fine. That's how it is.
Yes,
as a matter of fact, it is not how it is. Yes, it's not how it is. It's not how it should be. It's not how it can be.
Right.
So if we start framing it as sort of weaponization, we can start actually to address these issues more.
Right, to challenge it. Yeah, no, yes. I get that. That's very interesting. Okay, so I think I will pass it on to Ayah to give her feedback. Ayah, you have 15 minutes. You don't have to take the full time, but you have 15 minutes to give the feedback that you prepared for Hanna's presentation, and then we can open it up to Q&A.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Dana. Thank you, Hanna, for this informative paper. I actually enjoyed reading it yesterday, and honestly speaking, I experienced some experiences that you mentioned in that paper. So yes, the situation is harder when it comes to technology. And I have actually have some detailed, maybe Dr. Dana gave you more of general ideas how to actually develop your research project. And my comments are a bit more detailed. So I actually just let me open them. The document wasn't track changes. Excuse me, my computer. Okay. My first comment actually is. You mentioned that most West Bank areas are actually classified between A and B and C areas, and I would love to hear something about the situation in the areas of Jerusalem suburbs, because they're not classified as an A or a B or an area C. Besides, these areas are totally ignored by the Israelis. They're not part of the BA as well, so they actually have a very unique status. And it would be interesting to hear something about, or to see something about this area and what's the situation in that area. And I actually think here that in page 13, the experience of online learning that Birzeit University actually embarked on between March 2001 and June 2004. I'm not sure, to which extent this experience was really effective back then, because what we witnessed in the Palestinian universities here during the pandemic and the COVID-19 pandemic, all the universities there actually they faced a very severe problem transforming into virtual classes. So I'm not sure, back then, was it really effective? Was it really working? Back then, most universities had university portals, and it wasn't very unique to Palestinian universities. Besides, we still have, and we're actually facing problems when it comes to online learning. I actually think on page 15, when you actually mentioned the surveillance of the BA over internet, it's a very important debate. You can write a paper about this. However, I guess this is not relevant in this part, because you're actually mentioning, or in this paper, because you're mentioning, or you're discussing the colonial weaponization of access. So I'm not sure if, the debate of the Palestinian Authority here, is it relevant to your discussion or not? Again, the same page 15, we actually think the surveillance, the Israeli surveillance. It's important to mention, and I guess Dr. Dana mentioned that in her comments, that this surveillance, we need to see, or we need to read something about how the Israelis function this surveillance. For example, there is a cases where Israel could recruit collaborators through the internet surveillance. We call these, in Arabic, we call it isqat, or downfall. So we need to see really the direct impacts of that surveillance and the struggle in the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. Israelis are actually using the politics of sexuality as reflected in the violation of societal codes of women's purity and honor and sexual abuses, integrity and social respectability against Palestinians. So it's important to see and, to actually write something maybe about the impact of that surveillance in the struggle, and how this actually would complicate Palestinians' access to internet. Again, in the conclusion and discussion page, page number 16, I think it's important maybe because maybe you should include that in your paper. I'm not sure. It's just my thoughts. Israel actually are using a very important way of pressure against Palestinians when it comes to internet access. Yes, we actually moved like from one stage to another, and we managed to get successfully to where we are now, which is not bad for a country which is under prolonged occupation. But Israel keeps threatening Palestinians every now and then to cut all of the internet and isolate Palestinians from the outside world. And that, I guess, the last threat was when the Palestinians were or the Palestinian Authority was trying to cut the security coordinations with the Israelis. So they actually used it as a way to exert pressure. So the idea is like, this is still like a weapon in the hands of the Israelis, and they keep threatening Palestinians to cut them out from the outside world, which is a very possible scenario, though. And I guess at one point they may do it. So we never know. Thank you very much, and thank you again for the informative paper. I enjoyed reading the details, honestly.
Thank you, Ayah. Hanna, do you want to maybe respond for a few minutes? You have some time.
Yes, I'll do that quickly. Thank you very much, Ayah. So first, you mentioned about the case of East Jerusalem. In the slide, I mentioned the main areas as Gaza, East Jerusalem, areas A, B, and C. So so I did recognize that East Jerusalem is a very specific case in this regard. However, because I wanted to cover the different aspects of access to telecommunication, I focused on areas A and B mainly, and to some parts C. Now, in the about the experience of e-learning between 2001 and 2004, I didn't mean that it stopped in 2004. I meant that I used the work of Rima Hamami on the access to education between 2001 and 2004 as or the hurdles to access to direct access to university campuses in that period as a catalyst for universities to speed up their adoption of e-learning practices. And as a matter of fact, I was actually working on a proposal on a paper on how years of closures and occupation have prepped Palestinians to be ready for lockdowns during coronavirus. And I did a quick interview with people from some universities, and they said that for us, we didn't have to do anything. We already had the ability to switch. At Birzeit University, they had the ability to switch to 30 concurrent online classes already. After the lockdown, they increased it to 120 concurrent online classes, which is, by the way, it means almost 90% of the whole availability. Now, how effective is e-learning? That's a different issue. That's a different aspect. I'm here looking at how prepared was it and how ready was it. Now, when we talk about e-learning, we have multiple levels. First of all, I believe what you're mentioning when you say that universities have portals, it means that universities have portals where they can communicate one-to-one with students, when they offer access to documents and so on, which is different than conducting classes online. And that moved over the years. Now, you mentioned that the surveillance of the BA may not be relevant to this case. As a matter of fact, I used it as yet another example of different regimes with different powers. We can talk about a full state utilizing its powers over its people, and we can also look at pseudo state who wants to maintain its position through different means. Here, the work of Dana in her latest book, by the way, would fit perfectly here, and how the Palestinian Authority used different practices to maintain its control. One of them, I would argue, is the weaponization of access, of even of the limited power they have on control over access. You mentioned different examples and cases of surveillance. Yes, thank you. If I had the chance to expand this work, these will definitely be possible. However, it's very important to recognize the difference between the power over communication technology and the power to use communication technology to practice hegemony through different means. I am not aware of the threats to cut access to the internet, the ones you mentioned, and I would love to see if you could share with me links and so on. I will definitely plug it in the work because they are very good. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you guys. This is just one final thought because I'm chairing this session, so I get to I get to take precedence. No, I'm just kidding. I just, you may be able to capitalize on the variations across areas, perhaps, to demonstrate, the weaponization of access at varying levels of Israeli and PA control. That might be also a useful way to increase variation on your dependent variable, I imagine. Maybe not even having to incorporate other cases at all. That might be one way. Anyway, that's just a passing thought, and it just came to me right now. So we have one kind of general question, which is, what is the impact of your study about the situation in Palestine? I imagine this is an attendee, or perhaps, I'm not sure if it was an attendee or somebody from social media. But I guess the question is, how is your work, policy relevant? I imagine that's kind of what he's trying to say. But you can you can answer that question whatever way you want. So the question is, what is the impact of your study on the situation in Palestine?
Well, actually, there are two main ways and methods that this may have impact on people in Palestine. The first is relevant to something that I previously mentioned. When we start to recognize the limitations on access as a weaponization of this access and as tools of hegemony, we can better understand their effect, their larger societal effect, and we can as well. How to say it? Look at the resistance or at the acts to bypassing these limitations as acts of liberation. So instead of saying that people are using proxies or virtual private networks, VPNs or whatever as a form of some sort of hacking, no, we will start to look at as forms of resistance to weaponization. That's A. B, in terms particularly to Palestinians, we can start looking at economical limitations, as well as limitations to access to technology from that lens, and we can start, if the PLO had the chance to renegotiate whatever agreements or accords, that would be to really look at things. I mentioned that in the accords it says that networks should maintain compatibility, And that very simple term, which may sound good, allowed Israel to control what technology is there, to require pre-approval and so on. So it does have a larger policy effect in certain way.
Yes, thank you so much. Now we have a set of questions from one of our attendees. Pretty interesting questions. So perhaps you should jot these down because there's a number of them. So first, why did you treat the weaponization of access mainly from what Israel's been doing in Palestine? Knowingly after the conclusion of the Oslo Accords, the PA sold the telecommunication sector to the private sector, which has monopolized it ever since and therefore has weaponized it, if you will. And this access in not allowing competitors to enter the market. And then he says that he assumes you know the internet group called Salat and the recent crackdown on some of its activists. So he wants you to reflect on that, I guess. The second question is, why did you overlook the electronic surveillance or electronic, I guess, cybercrime law by presidential decrees, which has criminalized criticism of the PA and its officials? Is this not a clear example on how access has been weaponized on the part of the PA? And finally, what about the Israeli mobile chips sold in the Palestinian market to bypass PA control and get cheaper service? How do you see that influencing ways of access?
Thank you very much, Yazid. It's very important contribution. Now, I will start with the last one. I did actually mention in the presentation and to a larger extent in the paper itself how the ability of Israeli companies to offer better services in the Palestinian territory benefited these companies from a tax-free market, I would say, and tax-free operation that contributed to further loss to the Palestinian economy. That's for your second one. I believe I did mention it in the paper, the electronic crime law in certain way, because yes, it is important to look at different practices, including legal things. Now, for your first comment or question, the thing I was trying to highlight here in this paper and in this presentation is that regardless of who was the last mile provider of telecommunication to Palestinians, Israel still had control. So regardless of what company or companies provided your connection to your home, Israel still had control through first control over frequencies in terms of mobile telecommunication. In terms of access to the outside world, all communication lines, including internet, had to bypass through Israel and Israeli companies. And in terms of access to equipment, whether was it Paltel, whether was it X, Y, Z, or even if it was free and open market, Israel would still have control on who gets access to what equipment. So in reality, Israel here is the side that does the main weaponization. Now, I can see where you're coming from for this particular point, and I'm with you. Yes, there is a sort of monopoly that was formally ended in 2010, access to the internet, because the contract of Paltel being the exclusive seller of the internet ended in 2010. But then later on, the BA did a U-turn a few years later, and now the market is controlled in a way or another by Paltel, which I would imagine many scholars looked at as a representative of the Palestinian bourgeois, if I want to say, or something.
Did you finish your answer? I think okay. I thought you were cut off. The mute keeps coming on and off. Okay. Do we have any other questions from our attendees or panelists? Let me see here. Let me check also the social media questions. Okay, I guess, Hanna, you were so thorough that people are just, are gonna have to sit with this level of information and digest it a little bit. Thank you all so much for attending and for the very useful questions at the end there. And good luck, Hanna, with your work. I really see a lot of potential in it. Please stay tuned at 4:40. We will be resuming the Palestine Studies group with Ayah's paper. So thank you so much. Take care, everybody.
Thank you, Dana. Thank you, Ayah.